Like the epistle of 2 John, the epistle or the letter of 3 John is only one short chapter, and that shall be our text for today. I will read it, beginning with the first verse. The elder unto the well-beloved Gaius, whom I love in the truth. Beloved, I wish above all things that thou mayest prosper and be in health, even as thy soul prospereth. For I rejoice greatly when the brethren came and testified of the truth that is in thee, even as thou walkest in the truth. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth. Beloved, thou doest faithfully whatsoever thou doest to the brethren and to strangers, which have borne witness of thy charity before the church, whom, if thou bring forward on their journey after a godly sort, thou shalt do well. Because that for his name's sake they went forth, taking nothing of the Gentiles, we therefore ought to receive such, that we might be fellowshippers to the truth. I wrote unto the church, but Diotrephes, who loveth to have the preeminence among them, receiveth us not. Wherefore, if I come, I will remember his deeds which he doeth, prating against us with malicious words, and not content therewith. Neither doth he himself receive the brethren, and forbiddeth them that would, and casteth them out of the church. Beloved, follow not that which is evil, but that which is good. He that doeth good is of God, but he that doeth evil hath not seen God. Demetrius hath good report of all men, and of the truth itself, yea, and we also bear record, and ye know that our record is true. I had many things to write, but I will not with ink and pen write unto thee, but I trust I shall shortly see thee, and we shall speak face to face. Peace be with thee. Our friends salute thee. Greet the friends by name. John was an elder, and he greeted Gaius as an elder. Elders in the Scripture didn't too much have control between one church and another. Usually elders were appointed over specific churches. Ordinarily, in the scriptural account, it was the apostles who had the control over more than one church or over all of the churches, and so that they could assert that authority when it was necessary from church to church. Why then does John speak from one church to another as an elder? There are two possible answers in this instance. We will look at them both briefly. For one thing, St. John was an apostle. It was always John's custom, if you have read his letters, if you've read his gospel, to know that he never liked to draw attention to himself. He always referred to himself as that other apostle, and seldom, if ever, called himself by name. It is characteristic of John that he would have referred to himself by the lower of his two titles. John was an elder in the church where he functioned. He was also an apostle over the churches in Asia. There's another reason why John might have referred to himself as an elder in making this consultation with Gaius, and that is because John was the one who had brought Gaius into the faith. Gaius was, in biblical terminology, John's spiritual son. And this is borne out later when John commends him and says, I always rejoice to hear my children walk in the truth. And the use of the term my children when referring to a specific individual, as John was to Gaius, is pretty much limited to cases where that particular person was responsible for the other coming into the faith. We read in the Acts account that St. Paul, on his third journey, stopped through the town of Derbe, and there he met Gaius. And Gaius went with him on his third journey from Derbe to Lystra and then to Ephesus. From Ephesus up the coast of the Aegean Sea and across over into Macedonia and then down to Corinth. What we don't find recorded is that before St. Paul ever set foot on Asia, St. John had gone there as an evangelist in keeping with the Lord's commandment to go into all the world. And it was St. John who had brought Gaius into the faith many years before. Now, St. John is addressing a subject with Gaius which more or less follows upon the heels and in the sequence of the things that have gone before. In 2 John, we saw the apostle reminding the church that it was their responsibility to be disciplinary and not to be taken in by falseness and not to be taken in by false teachers and antichrists under the argument that we can't be judgmental and we must love. And John designated this letter to the church, not to any specific individual, because that's everyone's responsibility. And John didn't want to put the burden on any given individual. You know, Christian people in the church are often willing to have this happen. If something is addressed to a specific individual, then people tend to want to let that person handle it as if it's his duty. I believe that this is the very reason why this second letter of John was not addressed to any individual, but rather to the church at large, a rather interesting designation. Not too many letters written that way by the apostles. It was written in this way deliberately so that each individual in the church would get the point that this was to him and it was to be his responsibility. But what St. John now addresses, he designates to the most faithful man in this church. Which church was it? Well, it was probably the church in Derbe, although it's hard to be specific. Derbe was east of Asia in what was then Pisidia, is now part of Turkey. That's where Gaius lived when he first came into the faith, and tradition at least has it that he went back there. We don't know for sure which church he presided over, and it isn't really all that important. But he was the leading spiritual man in this church. And what St. John now had to give as a responsibility needed to be directed to the leaders, the faithful leaders of the church, for this would become their responsibility to carry out. In his salutation to Gaius, St. John expressed a concern for his health and for his material needs. In this passage, it is clear that St. John's real concern and real joy was with his spiritual prosperity, even as thy soul prospers. And I rejoice when the brethren testified that you walk in truth. We know this, and we are not of the Nicolaitans, who overemphasize health and wealth and fame and so on. Nevertheless, we should never take an indifferent, careless, unfeeling, or unsympathetic attitude towards people's material and physical needs. That's not the point. To keep the order straight and to emphasize the thing which is important does not mean to have a careless or an indifferent attitude toward those who are in material want or in physical difficulties. I wish that you prospered and were in health, even as your soul prospers. We have a understanding, which we believe is correct, of the relative importance of this physical person. Gaius was obviously in poor health and in poor circumstances because he had given his time and his energy to the missionary journeys of St. Paul. He had gone with him, traveled with him, and spent a great deal of time and effort in that regard. That was commendable, and John did not chide him for it, and emphasized what is truly important, his spiritual health. All the same, we know that it feels good to feel good, and it's very discouraging to feel bad, and material needs can sure put pressure on you. Now we can endure these things. We are frequently called upon to endure them, and with God's help, we're making a good trade. As St. Peter said, we're trading the things of this world for the riches of heaven, and you can't do better than that. And we can make it. All the same, it is our responsibility to be empathetic with those who are undergoing trials. Weep with those that weep, the Bible says, and rejoice with those that rejoice. St. John commended Gaius for his faithfulness and for his testimony that he had. And he said, I don't have any greater joy than this. When I hear that my children are walking in the truth, I am delighted. And that's really the thing that makes me feel good. And he said, you know, Gaius, you do faithfully whatsoever you do to the brethren and to strangers, which have borne witness of the charity, of your charity before the church. You're a faithful man, Gaius, and those things you do are good, and you have that testimony. People have come back and said, Gaius is a man that can be dependent upon to help us when we are in his territory and when we are in need. And St. John said, and you know, Gaius, if you bring these people forward on their journey after a godly sort, you shall do well. To help them for the right reasons and in the right way is a good work. Why did he say after a godly sort? Well, he just got through saying in 2 John that we don't want to let people put us in their power by saying we've got to love and we can't judge and come along and bilk us out of what we have, leaning on us, figuring a psychological way to extract from us our hard-earned money. This kind of mentality and psychology is at an epidemic proportion in the church today. Hucksters, con artists, money grabbers have figured out how to put people in a guilt complex and extract from them their money. And you can tell who they are. You can turn on the radio or the television and listen to them. You can't hear them for 5 minutes without their hollering for money. Where your treasure is, that's where your heart will be, and as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. That's what they want, and so that's what constantly comes out of their mouth. John didn't want Gaius or anyone else to get caught in that trap. Bring them on their way after a godly sort, always taking godliness into consideration. The real thing here, the good thing here. Who are these people? What are they up to? Do they have a legitimate need? Are we helping something that is good, or are we being taken by sharing with them what we have? That's always the counsel. If you do it after a godly sort, Gaius, you shall do well. Because that for his name, and that's Christ's name sake, they went forth taking nothing of the Gentiles. He said they didn't go out and round up money from whoever and wherever they could get it. They didn't ask the people that they were going to help to give them money. They didn't ask the unbeliever for anything. They wouldn't take it. They felt like the Lord could supply the needs of his people, and he didn't need the money of those who were not a part of the faith. Of course, today, religious men will take money anywhere they can get it and justify it on any ground. Well, I don't know just all that there is to say theologically about that, but I do know this, that St. John said these people wouldn't take any money from the unbelievers. That's the meaning of the term Gentiles in this instance, because Gaius was not a Jew. He was, in fact, a Roman. He was not a Greek either. And so when John said they wouldn't take anything of the Gentiles, he was talking to Gaius, who was of the faith, and saying they wouldn't take anything from unbelievers. This term changes depending on how it's used and what it means. And because they wouldn't do that, we ought to receive them that we might be fellowshippers to the truth. Well, why was St. John giving this information and this instruction to a man who already had a testimony for doing this? I mean, here's a short little letter, like the second letter, not much time and space to say what he had to say. What was St. John's point? Why, if this man already had this witness and testimony, did St. John need to give this counsel? Well, it's for a very simple reason. It comes out here. St. John had written and said to the church, don't be put in the power of those who are not sound in doctrine and who don't abide in the doctrine of Christ. And there was in this church a very troublesome, self-centered, self-seeking man named Diotrephes, one whom St. John said loved to have the preeminence. And he had taken the letter of 2 John and used it to exclude these people from the church and from its help. He picked at them. He argued about them, denied their doctrine, prated against them, St. John said, with malicious words, turned them away and wouldn't help them, forbid the brethren to do anything for them, and cast them out of the church. There's always somebody that can take the counsel of God and use it selfishly for their own reason. What was Diotrephes' reason? Well, he's connected in the Bible with idol making, gold and silversmith. Evidently, one of his motives was monetary, and if this money was given away to strangers, there's no way he could figure out how to get his hands on it. Another thing we know about him is he loved to have the preeminence. He wanted to be the boss. He wanted to be the big thing. He wanted to be the big show. And he didn't want anything done for anyone unless he had instigated or he had something to say about it, because he was a competitive man. And he prated against the apostles with malicious words, and St. John said, and he wasn't even content with that. He wasn't content with just lying about us and running us down and defaming these missionaries that I have sent out. He did other things. What all other things he did, we don't know here. We do know that in Ephesus, Gaius and another companion of his whose name slipped me, who was with Paul, were brought before the magistrate, and they were going to beat them, and it had to do with idol making. Some have suggested that Diotrephes was in on that. Maybe he was the one who was responsible for leading them before the magistrate. We don't know exactly if that's the case. But he did other things, and he prated against them with malicious words. Now remember that St. John had preached a message of love and of charity to the church. He had called upon them to meet the needs of the other and to be more concerned about the other than they were about themselves. And then he had to amend that, not change it, but add to it this counsel in the second letter: don't let people of unsound doctrine put you in their power. Now he has to add to that, don't let troublemakers, manipulators, and politicians take the Scripture and distort it and twist it. Diotrephes was saying, you know what John wrote? We don't want to take these people in if their doctrine isn't just like ours. We don't want to help them. We don't want to do these things for them. Who are they? Where are they going? We don't know who they are. They're not of us. And he was pushing them away. And St. John found it necessary to write to Gaius and to exhort him to remain faithful in this most important thing of bringing the servants of God on their way, helping them, supporting the work, and not let this mischief maker cause trouble. St. John said, when I come down there, I'll remember this man, and I'll remember his words. He's Diotrephes. Don't forget that name, Diotrephes. And he's an evil worker. St. Paul said something similar to that when he said to Timothy, Alexander the coppersmith caused me much evil. and you beware of him yourself, because he's an evil man. A man in the church masquerading under the guise of something that was good, but working mischief. And St. John called this man by name, and St. Paul called Alexander by name, and said to the church, don't listen to these people, beware of them. They're troublesome people. They're backbiters and railers. They prate against the true servants of the Lord with malicious words. They have carnal motivations. You know, one of the problems that one sees in Christianity today is, how long has it been since you have heard Christian leaders come out and identify some subtle evil worker in the church by name and warn the people of God to beware of him? Why, people almost lose their breath when you talk about it. Christian leaders lack the courage to do it. And you know what happens? These clever, cunning, evil workers get onto that, and they know you won't do anything about it. And so they just defiantly go about to work their mischief right under the nose and in the face of righteous men. I remember 22 years ago when I came to this church, there was a minister in this church who was an adulterous man, an evil, selfish, cruel, heartless man who destroyed family after family of people who supported him and helped him and believed in him. And under my guidance and the guidance of the elders, we attempted to discipline this man, and we couldn't discipline him. He wouldn't be disciplined, and finally he left the church because he wouldn't accept the disciplines that we had for him. And that man went throughout this community, a sly and cunning and diabolical fellow, realizing that there were religious people in the community who knew that there had been a minister at that church who was guilty of immorality but didn't know who it was. And that man actually passed his evil, conniving, filthy deeds off onto me. There are people in this community to this very day who believe that I was guilty of the things that that man was guilty of because he went around maliciously distorting and lying and manipulating the truth. Well, I was younger then. I did go to other churches where he went and met with their leaders and warned them against him and was able to save some of them some trouble. But you know, if I had to do it over again, what I'd do? I'd get up right up publicly on the radio and I'd call this man out by name and I'd say, you beware of this cunning, snaky, corrupt, despicable, ego-centered, lusty, and immoral man. That's what I do. I've learned a few things in the last 20 years, and one thing I've learned is a misguided sense of love and compassion for evil workers like this is unprofitable, and it leads to a lot of trouble in the church. And you know who's responsible? The Christian leaders who won't call these people out and identify them. That's what the council is here for. Call them by name. Diotrephes, Alexander, and whoever it happens to be. Oh, St. Paul said the Lord reward him for his evil deeds, but he said, nevertheless, let me tell you who he is and what he's done, and let me warn you to beware of him. We have often said that love has many faces. Christian people are foolish in this regard. They think that they're showing love. They think that they're giving the impression of love. They think that they're manifesting the character of love by being silent about these things, and they are not. They are not. The kindest, most loving thing you can do, not only for that individual, because if there's any hope for it, it's going to come by the bold slap of truth in the face of a heart that is hard. But the kindest thing you can do for others is to warn them to beware of evil, conniving, subtle, and cunning men. St. John says again, don't follow that which is evil. Follow after that which is good. He that doeth good is of God. He that doeth evil hath not seen God. You see, when it comes to sanctification and Christian living, holiness is a very practical thing. These evildoers are not of God. Why do we always think that the troublemakers, the backbiters, the railers, the praters, the malicious carriers of tales, the ones that go out of their way to make trouble, are of God? And why don't we ever stand up for, defend, side with, and find our identity with the righteous? There is that in fallen man responds to trouble, and troublemakers play on it. It is the responsibility of godly men to see that it doesn't happen. St. John said, I'll tell you who you set up in that church. You set up the people that have the good report. Demetrius is one. He has a good report of all men and of the truth. So get that Diotrephes out of there and get Demetrius in there, Gaius, and there'll be two good, solid leaders in that church that can lead people in the right way. You say, well, they say that Demetrius isn't good, and you say that he is. John said, come on, Gaius, you know that our record is true, and you know that Diotrephes' record is a lie. So if you believe him, it's your own fault. And that's the burden that the apostle had, and that's about what he had to say to that church. Put the lid on these evildoers, call them by name, stop them from their mischief, don't let them mislead the church. Put up in your church or leadership men of good report. Look to yourselves and keep yourselves in the love of God. This is the burden of the letter of 2 John that the apostle had for Gaius, his spiritual son, his spiritual son, his spiritual son, his spiritual